You are welcome to the Bainbridge Island Senior Community Center. This is something to talk about. We are doing this now at 1:30 p.m. Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, and we're grateful for the sponsorship from Fieldstone Communities of Bainbridge Island. They have day stay and respite programs and memory care up on Rolling Bay, and they are currently building assisted living and independent living. If you want to learn more or schedule a tour of the facilities that are up or learn about the ones that are getting built, call 360-689-4314. And I would like to acknowledge that we are meeting on the ancestral homelands of the Coast Salish people, specifically the Suquamish tribe, the people of the clear salt water. And our dear neighbors, we honor them and we are grateful for their continued and generous hospitality. Today, we are anticipating a rich conversation indeed, covering the 35 years of the Bainbridge Island School District's Multicultural Advisory Committee. And to get us started and facilitate the discussion, Ann Lovejoy is here. Thank you, Ann.
Thanks, Reed. I'm really excited about this program because I came to the island right about when this MAC was being formed. And it was one of the first social justice groups or activities I was aware of on Bainbridge Island way back in the day. And we're going to be joined today by a number of people who have been participants on the MAC, that council, that committee, and people who are presently engaged in it as well, which is pretty exciting. Right now, we have several people here, Jing Feng and Katie Curtis, and I see that Karen Vargas is trying to get on, so hopefully she'll be able to get on. Oh, there she is. Yay, Karen. Thank you. Welcome. So would one of you like to just talk a little about the early days? What I remember is that there were very few students of color at the high school and in the school systems, but they didn't all have a very smooth experience. And there were a lot of concerned parents and community advocates who really wanted to make sure that school was a healthier environment for everyone, especially children of color. And also to provide support for their parents and families and for the teachers and the district itself to how to create a healthier school environment. And I thought that was fantastic. And I know some of you were there really early on. Jean, you were one of the early people involved in that, were you not?
I was not as early as many others. I came on board early 2000s and was honored to serve with Katie and with Akuye, Frank Kitamoto, Charlotta Revelstad, and I co-chaired in the early 2000s. Karin Ahern. My very first meeting, I sat next to Gina Corpus. And so there have been people involved with this in the caring about our students of color. And while they were few were in number, there were still many to pay attention to. And I think some of these, while there has been much progress and the language and the vocabulary we used has changed, I think some of the challenges still persist.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Akuye, you're here to join us. Can you pitch in on that a little bit too? You're muted.
While she's getting unmuted there,
yeah.
Akuye, I'll jump in. I just want to acknowledge that that the Indopino and Filipino American community, in a way, what I've heard is that the children of the Indopino Filipino American community, they were like invisible to the in the schools, and so it was the those parents, like I heard that actual community members started coming to the school in order to kind of help be present, just to have a presence for their students. And then what I heard what happened was that there was a meeting for the school board of prior students who had gone through, who were now parents that had gone through the system, you know, who were really wanting to advocate for students of color and for specifically like Filipino American and Indopino American students, because the schools just weren't serving them. And from this big voice that finally was being heard by the school board, it was determined that there needed to be a multicultural advisory council. And it's an important distinction that it's an advisory council versus a committee, because the council is isn't put together necessarily exactly by and for a certain purpose. So it's not like a financial committee, it's a multicultural advisory council. So Akuye, if you wanted to unmute, I'll turn that over to you.
Hey family, hey everyone. Sorry, we were just we were in the middle of funeral services over here we were conducting that, so I wasn't able to speak. But what I know about the Multicultural Advisory Council was back when I first arrived here back in the early 90s, and was having difficulty with my children in the school district. And when I went up to the school district, I was introduced to Maria Rivera, and also to many of those that was on the MAC Council. And at that time, Frank Kitamoto was one of the individuals that brought me into the work. He had a display of the Japanese internment that they would have in the old library in the old building. And he was assembling that, and he called me over. And that's when I began the work, and he began to share the history, how back in the early 70s that many of the students of color, many of the Indopino, the Filipino, the native students, some of the Hispanic students and Asian students were dropping out of school. And their parents were very upset about what was going on in the school district, that those parents went up to the Bainbridge Island School District and began to share their disappointment, be able to share their hearts of what was happening. And at that time, that's when the Multicultural Advisory Council began to formulate it. They were working with those parents. They were working with Colleen Amuela, with Gina Corbis, with Frankie Tamoto, with many of the parents that was there. And they began to say they have to hire a multicultural advisory specialist or teacher, counselor, and they began to shape and mold this work that is now the Multicultural Advisory Council. And they hired Maria, they hired Millie, they hired Colleen, they hired Gina. At that time, many of them came through that process. So that was the early beginnings of the story that Frank had shared with me. And even when I went up in the early 90s, it took a while. I could go to their meetings, but they did not appoint me to the Multicultural Advisory Council. I would talk to Maria, I would talk to Frank, and I could go to the meetings, but I was not officially a Multicultural Advisory Council member. I was a community member that was sitting in on their meetings. And so that was addressed because for many years I had put in application, but was never given the opportunity to sit on the council.
I know we're hoping that Colleen and Gina will be able to meet us, join us after a while. But I know Robin Hunt, you were also quite involved early on. Is that not so? Do you want to jump in a little bit about that?
I was on the school board at the end of the 80s and early 90s, and I was the the liaison from the school board to the Multicultural Advisory Committee when Gina Corpus, whose last name was Vicente back then, was the chair. And that's it was in 91 that when the white supremacist group targeted Bainbridge to get rid of all the people of color. And and I don't know if it's Junko Haruri or who first or Karen Ahern or somebody or how Gina got wind of it, but they came through the Multicultural Advisory Council, I believe. It got to people's attention, and then Mayor Sam Granado appointed Gina and me to head up a task force or a committee to figure out what to do about it. So,
And that led to the students' march, did it not?
right, and then 2,000 people from around the island each contributed $1 to pay for the centerfold of the Bainbridge Review. We didn't have internet back then. Junko Harui wrote a statement, and I don't know exactly what it was, but it was something like, efforts to split our community apart or pit one against the other will not succeed, and we will not tolerate it. A strike against one is a strike against us all. And then the TV from Seattle covered the student march. Sam Granado was leading. I've got pictures of him leading the march downtown, and the school and MAC and teachers and students and all sorts of folks from around the community banded together, as we were told that the best thing we could do would be to stand up to these people publicly, that we were not going to be a good target for their hatred. And if we just all cowered quietly and scared in our own little corners and didn't say anything, that would be, and that's exactly the type of fertile ground they want. So we did, everybody got together, they gave up and snuck away in the undercover of darkness, and then murdered an Asian man down in Olympia.
I do remember that. But what I remember as a new Islander back and then, well, not so new at that point, but that the kids organized that march, I was really impressed by it.
Yeah, and I think though that they had the kids organized it, but I think that Eric Hoffman, I don't know if he was a teacher at the middle school or the high school, but there were some other adults behind. I mean, the kids did it, but there were adults supporting them wholeheartedly in that effort. Yeah.
I know that for a number of especially Native families and Indepino families, there really was not just the invisibility, but the bullying and harassment that came from other students, and sometimes even from teachers and other, parents of other students. And that was really hard for Bainbridge to admit. I think Bainbridge has a wonderful story about how progressive and liberal we are, and we also aren't. And I think those blind spots, what we call the hidden history, is something that's really important to call out and preserve.
Yeah. That came to light when Rabbi Scott Sperling and I think Mac, I'm not sure, but people from all over the community, but we had a meeting in the old high school commons, a public forum, and the whole idea was to have breakout sessions and figure out how we could keep these external white supremacist groups from targeting us to trying to do people in. But during the course of those workshops, what you were just talking about, number of people from the island who'd been multi-generations, particularly those of Asian descent, came forward to tell how, and black women and different, they've been discriminated against. They'd never come forward publicly, that rocks thrown at their houses, someone not being able to cash a check at the grocery store without ID where the white people could, the Indepino kids hanging out by a grocery store were called a gang, and the white kids hanging out were called the youth. A black woman being let off at her home by a taxi driver who thought she was the maid and wasn't going to let her out. There's a whole series of people who hadn't ever spoke about this publicly, courageously shared during this forum, and it was a really, really eye-opening to Bainbridge Island that thought the threat was just external. And we really were going to try to fix things, and here we are, whatever it is, 30 years later, and we're confronting, although we're becoming more open to trying to change.
I was just reading a study about how hard it is to change habits And, they were saying, oh, it can take months. I was like, honey, it can take centuries. But I think one of the hardest things is we all want change. It seems so obvious. Like, of course, we want to be helpful and kind to our students. Of course, we want our kids to have great education. Of course, we want fairness and equity. And yet it seems to be extremely difficult to manage to actually do that. I've heard, I talked to Kathy Katagama Joyce, who was then Kathy Roberts, who told me about getting a phone call at 3 o'clock in the morning that was a death threat, but it didn't go to her. It went to another Kathy Roberts on the island. They knew the name, but they got them mixed up. And so poor Kathy Roberts, who was not involved in this, was terrified that she was going to be killed, and talked to the police. And it turned out they were actually trying to threaten Joyce, Kathy Joyce, but that any of the people of color who were involved in this got threatened and got harassed. And it was, I think that was one of the things that was hardest for some of the longtime white neighbors to understand and accept, that could this really be happening here? But when that, if it happened to the wrong Kathy Roberts, it kind of woke a lot of people up, because she talked widely and told a lot of people about what was going on.
And Gina and I were threatened too, and the police had to put taps on our phones to try to catch them, but it didn't work.
Yeah, and I know that Dr. Kitamoto got a dead rat put in his mailbox too. And it's very true that hearing these stories are shocking, and now recently, MAC is still working on trying to, like even before George Floyd and all of this stuff, where seems to be more conversation, MAC has been really, really working hard to talk about race equity in the school system. And it was very interesting. I don't know if anybody wants to talk about it, but it was very interesting because this was MAC was started by communities of color. And it really was, to address racism and multiculturalism, and then what was interesting is there just kept being kind of a pull. This is what I've heard. Other people were there, but there kept being a pull to be so inclusive in a way that would distract away from race. So of course, when people started talking about LGBTQ issues and things like that, then some of the parents of color, were like, okay, this is important, and I don't see where we're moving race equity forward, and then there was another manifestation of that later where we were talking about struggling students. And so we wanted to include different learning abilities, or we wanted to include struggling students. And again, it was like the parents of color were like, okay, yeah. And talking about that, is those two subjects were more comfortable, I think, for people in the district than talking about race. So I just think that it's an interesting evolution.
Well, I think we're still uncomfortable talking about race. And one of the things that, again, is the hardest is the unrecognized, or as Rita was calling out in the chat, unrecognized or unacknowledged racist behavior that continues. It's still a hard conversation to bring up. And there's a lot of pushback when you do, because it's uncomfortable. But we're trying so hard. And I think one of the pieces that we as elders need to kind of embrace is being a place, being people who can handle discomfort and model handling discomfort to the community. That's a role that we can play, all of us, any color, white people too, who need to pick up the burden on some of this work, and say, yeah, we need to have these open conversations and be able to discuss difficult topics with discomfort as our companions, because unless we do that, it's just not going to happen. And we need to bring it down the generation. So it's an important family conversation, grandchild conversation, something we can take to the community in many different settings, whether at church or different social groups. And I feel like that piece, it's not just up to Mac to do this work. It's really up to all of us to do this work.
I just want to give a shout out to Akuye and Katie and Robin, because for as long as I've been on the island, you know, we're going on close to 8 years, I always thought everybody would felt really comfortable about race because of them. Because when Akuye walks in a room, we're moving equity forward. Like, we're talking about race. When Katie would go into a room, we're talking about the internment. When Rob, I mean, like, these discussions of bringing up the protests were just normalized around. I forget that's a privilege, because then when I go in the city hall and hear someone say I'm uncomfortable about using the word race, I was a little confused. I was like, I'm sorry, Mr. Dietz, I don't understand why you're having an issue when all the ladies around me tend to have no problems at all talking about race. So I do think you have force as elders to be an example, because it would appear that social justice is run by mostly ladies and Reed on the island and nobody else. I'm just saying what I see.
Akuye, do you want to speak to that? Your hand is up.
Well, you know, what I would say is that it has been a journey. You know, the way we are received and welcomed into spaces now was not the case when I first moved here in the early 90s. We were threatened by the Klan. We would come, our children would be targeted. Of course, they were just like the Filipino and Filipino. They were a gang. Our children couldn't walk in a collective way down the street or up to the library or down to over to Safeway or down to TNC. They were monitored, you know, they were very much targeted, and they were Black on Bainbridge. And they, you know, they were, in my word, being racially bullied from the time that they moved here, migrated here, from the time they were in elementary until the time they left. That was my engagement. I went back to school with all of my children because of the behavior that was occurring to them. And then how my children would come home crying, one not talking, one being, you know, labeled violent, the other one saying he don't want to be Black. And I had to find out for myself what in the world was going on in the school system, in their educational, in that learning environment that made these babies, because they were in elementary at that time, they were, you know, they were kindergarten, third grade, and second graders. And so for them to say, you know, your daughter, she's got some learning disabilities, something's going on. And here it was, this was Miss Bumblebee. She, you know, buzzing around talking, but when they came to me saying that she doesn't engage, she doesn't talk and everything, to find out what was going on in her IEP, when I went up there and my daughter busting out crying as a third grader and saying, Mommy, they bully me, they spit on me, they call me nigger, they kick me. And so her response was to withdraw and just stand around and not engage. To stand on the playground with her back against the wall. And then, because the teachers say, even during recess, she doesn't engage, she doesn't do this, she doesn't do that, she doesn't talk in class, she doesn't do these things. And that was what really alarmed me, that there was something deeply disturbing going on in that learning environment. And so, and then, you know, my youngest, he was deemed violent because when they spit on him or kicked him, he punched them in the nose. So he was the problem. And so he had a difficult time in the school district. And my oldest, he did not want to be Black. He cried and kicked and screamed and did all he could to assimilate, to be accepted, to find a place of belonging in that learning environment. So there are many things that we can say and we can do, but these are things that we have to address that are deeply rooted in our communities and in our school districts, that until we address them, they're not going away. We have to begin to say, how will we talk about these things, deal with these things, address these things, and be able to say we've got a lot of work to do when it comes down to racism and how it manifests in our communities, in with our children in school districts and all over.
Well, that certainly is absolutely right. And the fact that these things still go on after years of this work, I think can be disheartening. And yet there are also some really positive steps forward. Chastity, you're involved now with MAC, right? Do you want to say a little about what's going on with MAC today? Oh, sorry, you're not available to do that. Because I know I would like to hear from any of you to talk a little bit about the kinds of things put in place to help students, how and help educators, help the parents, like what has been part of MAC's contribution through the years to try to change the culture and create a healthier one. Katie, do you want to say something about that? And then Chas, maybe when you get a chance.
I'm going to type some things in because I'm listening to my elders. I don't know if you want the historical or you want now. So I'll write in a few things, but I think I want to hear from our elders. So.
Well, one of the, let's see. So some of the things that MAC has done is we always supported the culture fair, which was at Woodward School. So for a period of time, there were Woodward School used to do something called Culture Fair. And it was when students would go to their families and find someone who inspired them in their family background and talk about their family background. And so that was, something that that MAC supported, and we hope to bring back now after COVID as well. Then MAC has also developed more recently something where we would have conversations about films that we would show, and it was called Salon Nights, and we would show films like The Color of Fear or different interesting films, and then have conversations after them. And I think that one of those films really inspired us to have more program around the 1991 white supremacy incidences on Bainbridge. And so MAC kind of, also is a great collaborator, and MAC members are usually pretty involved in community in a lot of ways. And so, for example, there's wonderful, if there's Martin Luther King celebrations, I just want to acknowledge Akuye's daughter is actually the one that brought that to say that she wanted to make sure that the school district celebrated Martin Luther King's birthday. And that wasn't until I think 2003, that the schools even did Martin Luther King assemblies. And now Chastity's been helping, and we've been helping, and Akuye has tomorrow there'll be assembly up at the high school for Martin Luther King. So those are some of the things that MAC has done. I know that a few years ago, I was involved in, and Akuye was very involved in developing incident report procedures, for people to be able to say what's going on. And there's a now, they wanted to have an anonymous line where you could report incidences that were happening, and they were trying to, capture that kind of thing. And really in the flavor of MAC, Akuye helped to call people together just in the last, I don't know, Jing can talk a little bit more about that. Now the city has a council committee that works on race equity. And that was a similar thing where it was like the voices of the community came out, and then there was something established in the city. So those are just some of the things that come to mind.
Jing, would you like to add to that?
Sure. When Katie had mentioned that MAC had been collaborating or working with Woodward Middle School regarding their culture fair, the thing that also came to mind was that there were some parents who were really uncomfortable with culture fair, also particularly if they had adopted kids and with the family trees. And so to expect a kid to understand and go back and get evidence of their family background, given their particular circumstances, was really insensitive. So in the early 2000s, I think every council members will have their marks or their focus. But in the 2-3 years that I was on MAC, I guess we were kind of known as quote unquote rabble rousers. And where we, as Katie also pointed out, race was important to talk about, but it wasn't the only thing we looked at in terms of equity. It was really and truly just the name itself, multicultural advisory. And so we looked at gender identity, and then it was still one of the, it was an uncomfortable thing to talk about then. And I remember some of the teachers, and I'm trying to remember the beloved teacher at the high school who died.
Rob Goldsworthy.
Thank you, Akuye. And there were teachers who students and parents knew were gay. We didn't even talk about trans then. We didn't talk about those. We did not talk about that. And so, and teachers hid their sexual orientation and gender identity. But we did include and talk about that as far as multicultural advisory. So, and religious freedom as well. So I'm remembering, in addition to advocating for adoptees at the Woodward Culture Fair, there was an issue with Young Life at the high school, where there were Young Life leaders, adults, who had access to the lunchroom, and they could sit there and have lunch with the kids where no one else could. And that was reflective of the principal at that time, who allowed these two people to go into the lunchroom, buy kids lunch, where no one else could do that. And another issue we brought up had to do with rent, and the Boy Scouts being able to get a discounted rent. They had different and they still do have different classifications for how much rent the school district will levy for a group, whether it has to do with if you have kids involved or you're a nonprofit. And we brought up the Boy Scouts homophobic policies and asked, should they be in this certain rent classification when they have this policy? I think it's really important to point out that MAC is not only students and community, but teachers also. And so there are teachers who serve as MAC representatives. And at that time, I think the community members, we felt that we could do more with our teachers. And we were trying to support them, but we had separate meetings, which was kind of crazy when you think about it. And sometimes we would meet together. And just because community members have certain vocabulary doesn't mean that the language used in schools or the understanding of what equity is in schools is shared. So supporting teachers with training, being able to speak candidly. I think there's that uncomfortableness also amongst teachers, and I think that still exists. So however we can educate and let everyone know that they have such a huge impact on our young people is important. We also had really active young people on MAC at that time. Mark Salanga, you remember Mark Salanga, and Angie Rapata, and and there were some other ones, and their enthusiasm and commitment and their bravery for standing up not only for themselves but for other students, and for trying to inspire and get other students involved. We didn't have an equity group amongst the students at that time. We did Akuye, remember, we did have United Brothers and Sisters.
Yes, UBS,
at
they
that time.
played a key role. Our
They
students
did.
played a key role in moving
Absolutely.
equity forward in the schools. They would get trainings as well. We would take them to Wasami and we would always take them to the Human Rights conferences every year. They'd be able to have youth voice with the youth conference that they would go to, come back, bring all that information back to their peers and to the school district, and would represent our Bainbridge Island School District countywide at the human rights conferences. And Frank and teachers and supporters would get them there and bring them back. And we very much empowered the young people to play a role of change in their schools. UBS would host, they would have mix it up during their lunch periods where they would address some of the diversity, some of the issues that was coming up. They would talk with their teachers. I remember, there was a lot of conflict with This Is Now, with the students that was dealing with some of the loss, some of the abuses, and youth against domestic violence, and with those students that was dealing with gay rights and all of those issues that was surfacing with rape and domestic violence, and with loss, with those young people that got in the accident on Tolo. The students took a stand and created their own theater production of This Is Now, that was then. And they would talk about those issues. And Vince Palazzo, they very much was a part of the change that needed to happen when it came down to diversity and multicultural, and to be able to give them value and voice in some of the issues that was coming up when those students they were experiencing the bullying and experiencing the writing on the walls, those things, the very negative language that was coming up. They would address that.
I just wanted to piggyback off that, and then I'll gladly let someone else say something. But when Robin was talking about the white supremacist groups that came on the island in the early 91, I think. 91. Okay. And then they came back again in 2001, when the Jewish section of Port Blakely Cemetery was destroyed, as were other Japanese American headstones. And so at that time, MAC was a convener, if you will, And it was really kind of on the boots on the ground type of community organizing. So we, with a whole, I'll never forget this, we just convened community leaders and we met in that tiny room at the police station and decided to put together a community rally called Take a Stand Against Hate. And over 1,000 people came to that rally, but it was also working with Kitsap Human Rights and with the police department. And, you know, Robin, you talked about feeling like your life was threatened. And, you know, Akuye, I'm sure you have felt that many times. And that was the first time that I had really questioned myself to say, should I take a step back when I felt that my kids could have been threatened because some of the work I had been doing then. But Mac was a convener in that case and a partner. And the other one that I remember vividly was when the Snow Falling on Cedars premiere came, and we put together an event with the premiere, and as only Frank could, David Gooderson at that time had premieres all over the country, and had designated BIJAC as the recipient of the proceeds. And Frank said, no, no, no. And also named the Historical Museum, MAC, BPA, and the library to share the profits and benefits of the film. And we had the reception and discussion, if you will, in the old Commodore gym. And for many people, it was not only for people who had been incarcerated in camp the first time to talk about their experience, but for many of the neighbors. I remember speaking to a man who had gone to high school with his classmates that were incarcerated, and he said it was the first time that he talked about it with them. We had excerpts from journals that we had enlarged, we had photos. It was an amazing event. So as a convener, to be able, sometimes an event, a book can provide an opportunity to speak about something for the first time. And so Robin talked about not having internet then. We didn't have social media. So the way you put out your information was the TNC reader board and some email, and that was about it. So now we have many more tools.
Or a letter to the review, right?
Yes, or a letter to the review. Right?
Remember, the review used to have 46 pages. It was actually a community organ at that time.
And the police blotter.
Yeah. Akuye, you got your hand up.
There was a police blogger. What?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
It was the best.
Akuye, you got your hand up. I don't know if you can.
I'm so grateful, Jing, about you talking about that. But even during that time, Frank had a lot of pushback just getting some of the materials in the school. There were those that, and I don't recall the gentleman's name, that gave him such a terrible time, pushback on just, Sakai getting the curriculum, all those things. They felt that they shouldn't be taught the military. Oh, that's him. Yes, could you please talk a little bit about that?
Jim Olson.
Yeah, that's right. And when the district was trying to do the social studies program on global studies, and a bunch of parents got together, and Jim Olson and his wife were among them, really protesting that it was destroying family values, and it was all about globalization, and it was taking away from local. Kathy Joyce talked quite a bit about that too, that same pushback that's occurring today around the districts. And I don't know if you get a chance to look at the chat here, Chastity's been putting things in about some of the stuff that MAC has been supporting more recently, but one of the organizing the equity policy advocacy group for school board meetings has been huge, because what has happened there is we're having people from the county and some folks from the island go to school board meetings and protest that the teachers are now teaching critical race theory, which is ridiculous, and protesting that the teaching truth is racist and makes white children feel terrible. And it's a very similar to what happened back, 25 years ago when these things first started. And the district doesn't really have a lot of protection. So one of the things, Rachel Reese, among other parents, has organized a group of adults to show up at these meetings and say that they're in favor. And one thing Cassidy did was give us all links to write to teachers to support them. And that's something we can all do today, right now, is go to school board meetings virtually or in person and say, we support what the district is doing. We support what MAC is doing. We support our kids and our teachers, because otherwise all the time is taken up with these negative comments. And it's really just an attempt to waste the time of the school board and block them from doing their real work.
And that came, I just want to give props. That came because Akuye was telling us we need to link up with Seattle and we need to link up Kitsap and go all the way to Bremerton and Port Orchard and be one and really collaboratively work together. And that was Jesse at Teaching Truth over there who was doing the Pledge for Truth. And when we've done that for 2 years in a row, and what came of that was we realized the school, I've gotten so many talked to by administration about Chaz, there's freedom of speech, and I understand that, but then I push back on how can they say these things around children, things that you wouldn't say in a classroom, they're saying in school board meetings. And so Bainbridge has been pretty protective. So we have someone in there at every meeting, thanks to the dedication of Rachel Reese and Janet. By the way, several of us that are working are also school district employees. So know that there's a line. I'm not sure where it is, and I won't ask where it is because Robin might have to tell me and I'll get fired and that wouldn't be good. So we're not even going to do that. But working collaborative, like really working on the bigger campaigns of the national campaign. And now Kitsap Coalition is working with Race Forward and GARE in the HEAL campaign. And that campaign is organizing around the same information that the Race Equity Advisory Committee, and I think our city council members were there. I know Brenda was there and Ashley, that's all I'll say. But I'm just saying that it organizes around the same idea that this attacks are happening in 17 states are going to ban MLK. Right? They're not going to talk about MLK, this MLK in curriculum, 17 states. So we have, even though we're progressive, the ideas and the things behind Frank Kitamoto and Mac and these people who have been doing this, Jing, Robin, and Katie, they have to be carried on in a way, in a really insightful way to push back that our island, this multicultural Bainbridge Island, needs the internment story. It needs every Black person that Karen Akuye Vargas brings to light about our history. Because every time she brings someone to light, we know the true impact of the real history that we're multicultural. Every Jewish leader, everyone who contributed to making this island great. And we're not going to give it back to a bedroom white community. We're not. It's not going to be the story. There's a bigger story. So that's all.
Is that all? God. Look at this group. This is so amazing. I just love the fact that there are so many of us working for years and years and years, willing to stand up and still aflame, still on fire after many years. That is so beautiful. And, those of us who, like I said before, maybe as elders, we don't feel like our fire is burning quite as hot. There's still a lot we can do, even in smaller ways.
There's a lot of spice on this Zoom call right now. I wouldn't take any of you in dodgeball or any other argument on history. So let me just step back and say, y'all are spicy. What's up, Martha? We got Catholic spice. We got all kinds of spice on the Zoom call.
That's right. We may be elders, but we are fiery elders. And that's just awesome. One of the things I think about a lot is the fact that it isn't enough to talk to the students and the teachers. We have to kind of reach out to the parents too. And that's something that can be harder to do. As you know, I've organized the Transfriending group for support of people in gender exploration and transition. And trying to reach the PTA is really difficult. I mean, I've given some programs at like Boys and Girls Club and the teen space, but it's not easy to do that. And one of the things I think MAC has a longer arm maybe in that way, that and they've done a lot to try to wake up the parent population as well. Because often the parent of the children who are being harassed and bullied are perfectly aware of what's going on, but the parents of their friends are not necessarily aware, or the parents of the perpetrators are not necessarily aware or real open to that information. And that's something that I'd love to have a bigger public conversation about. And again, as elders, as grandparents, is something we can carry forward and be the ones to call it out, because that doesn't risk our children in school so much, right? We're different targets, I guess I could put it that way. And I would love to see that be something that comes out of this conversation and others like this conversation. Reed?
I feel like one of the things that we've been able to do as an island, thanks in many ways to Dr. Kitamoto, is to turn the story into a positive story, that there's a positive future. And I've mentioned Layla Saad before, but she talks about being good ancestors. And so this conversation allows us the opportunity to start to tell a story that we can be proud of, whereas some of the things that we're talking about are difficult and we don't want to talk about because they make us ashamed, or we don't know how to respond to them. And so, I mean, it's a difficult transition, but the only way is to go through it, I think. And I'm hoping that maybe the conversations around Stamped will help our community at least touch on race in ways that that maybe we have been, well, not maybe, we certainly have been avoiding because we like to think that that's an old problem. That's not a current issue.
Exactly. And I've had some interesting conversations along those lines with people who explain that they've never experienced it as white people, so it can't really be present. You're like, wow. It's really seriously. But I think one of the ways, the things that's most helpful is coming at it, as you say, in a positive way and trying to frame it in terms of what can we do? What's the next step? What are other options? Where can we pour our support and love and get some effect out of that? Robin, you want to jump in?
I had 2 quick points. One is that Chaz and the contemporary Mac and the people who worked with her finally achieved more integration into the curriculum instead of just a Black History Week or Indopino Week. This is something we talked about way back, decades ago. It's certainly been a vision, and I'm just so proud of this latest group. And I know there were other people in Chaz, but I think of Chaz as the dogged, leader of this group that finally got it done through a lot of persistence and education and enlightenment. So I say kudos to you. And then the other point I want to make, when you're talking about whether you want to talk about fire or this group or whatever, one of the things that I have enjoyed, and Akuye led the way back and led the way, even though she and her family ran up against all kinds of barriers, as did many other people of color on the island. Here, Akuye did not give up ever and say, might have been really discouraged and sad, but never gave up and to say this is impossible. She would just keep doggedly, as she does now, doggedly trying and believing that there would be light eventually. And I think a lot of folks who have been, making inroads are following that type of attitude. Instead of saying it can't be done, I give up, they keep hanging in there and making incremental changes, which is how you get there eventually. So
Exactly.
None of us are going to be Frank or Akuye. Let me just help you out with that. It's probably not going to happen. So we can be like a pinky or a toe or a toe jam. That's it. That's all we got. And some of us, you know what? That's good for me. I feel good about that. I'm not trying to be, but to understand the footsteps are really big of Frank, but also the bigger story, the Jings and the Charlottas, the bigger story of it is that it took community during the forced removal. It took community during that protest. They're all along. I go into schools all the time. So today I was at Polesville Elementary and I was like, hey, y'all, you have a history of people in your community stepping up for people. So we don't talk about them because you only know Rosa Parks, MLK, and Oprah. But if we added the women, the gay folks, the trans folks, to all the people you heard, the Asian, you would know that there's been more people. So when we talk about change makers, we give hope. That's why we tell the bigger story of Bainbridge. We have to tell because all the bad stories are the ones you hear. And right now at our high school, we're talking about rape and we're talking about mental health and we're talking about suicide. If we don't get a bigger story, our young people are going to suffer. So we need akuyes. We need those big steps. We need the pinkies and the toes. We need the toe jams. We need it now. And we need you to donate to the schools too.
Chas, your shoes are pretty big too, honey. Akuye, you got your hand up.
Yeah, you know, one of the things that I always say to the young people is that you make a difference. We diligently try to take our students every year to Diversity Makes a Difference so that they could be immersed in the environment where those young people were making a difference in their communities and in their schools, and their voice mattered and everything. And they just taught them that everybody can be great because everybody can serve. And that is something that Martin Luther King says. Everyone makes a difference when they come in a collective way to make the impact for the transformational change that needs to happen. And it's going to take all of us to be able to make that type of paradigm shift as we move forward. And that's one of the things that I stay hopeful for. I speak and I encourage and I inspire and I empower people to say, you make the difference for your life moving forward and for our lives too. Because I tell them, look, I've lived my life, but you can make our future better. You can do that. And so one of the things I say to even all of those here, all of us have now come into this collective, unified work with our minds being open to what the needs are. Yes, it's taken us a journey to get to where we are now, but as we move forward, moving forward with intensity, moving forward with intention and being deliberate on addressing these issues so that we can deal with the systemic things that we do need to be able to break down barriers and really build a collected, beloved community, because it's us. It starts with us. It's our future. We have to do it, and it's going to take all of us to make this shift and make this change. And so those are the things I say to all of those. We are the community. So if we look at ourselves and look at how we are engaging with one another, we can get to the root of what we need to do to move forward in a healthier way. Because it's our behavior, it's our attitudes, and it's our character that's hindering us from moving race equity or any kind of issue forward that we need to move when it comes down to health and well-being of our entire community. And I'll say that, and I'll keep saying that. You know, nothing changes until I do. And that's the motto that our young people, nothing changes until we do. So we point at ourselves. It's our behaviors that need to change. So those are the things I'll keep saying, even to those that are here today. We can make the difference, and we can make the impact, and we can make the change.
You know, that's exactly what Junko used to say too, all the time. I remember when he and I went to help clean up those broken graves, those desecrated graves, taking paint remover and crowbars to put, and there were a bunch of people there working together, and Junko kept saying, this is what it takes. This is what community does. Like you don't accept it and you fix it as best you can, and you move forward a bit, you do it together. And he always said that, like, nobody can do it alone, but we can all do it together, but the change is from us. Right? Well, thank you, everybody. I think we're kind of out of time, but what a another rich, beautiful program. And thank you all so much for your contributions.